In the summer of 1998, 4 cousins vanished from a campsite on the edge of Lake Halstead, Texas. They were last seen roasting marshmallows beneath a canopy of stars, their laughter carrying across the water. By morning, their tent stood empty, their shoes still by the fire, their belongings untouched. Search teams combed the woods for weeks. Not a trace was found. For a quarter of a century, the families were left with only questions, haunted by the silence of a lake that gave back nothing. Until now. Before we start, hit subscribe. July 11th, 1998. The air was hot, thick with humidity that clung to every surface. Mosquitoes buzzed near the waterline of Lake Halstead, their sound mingling with the soft crackle of a campfire. 4 cousins, Daniel, age 17, his sister Katie, age 15, their younger cousin Josh, age 13, and the youngest, little Emily, just 10, sat in a circle, marshmallows skewered on sticks, glowing orange in the flames. Daniel strummed softly on a borrowed guitar, his voice low and confident, while Josh tried to harmonize badly, making Katie laugh so hard she almost dropped her marshmallow into the fire. Emily curled up in her sleeping bag near the circle, eyes heavy but refusing to sleep, determined not to miss a single second of their summer adventure. They were kids on the edge of growing up, savoring freedom in the woods, unaware that the night would outlive them in whispers, theories, and nightmares. By dawn, the campsite was silent. When their parents arrived to check on them, they found the fire cold, the tents unzipped, and a half-eaten bag of marshmallows on the picnic table. Shoes were neatly lined up near the tents, flashlights untouched. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading away. It was as if the night had simply swallowed them whole. For weeks, the town searched. Volunteers with bloodhounds, helicopters dragging infrared scanners across the water, divers pulling themselves through murky depths filled with weeds. Nothing. Rumors spread. Runaways. Cult activity. A stranger lurking in the woods. Some swore the lake itself took them, an old curse dating back to when farmland was flooded to create Lake Halstead in the 1950s, swallowing entire barns, homes, and graves. But the official report said only one thing: missing, presumed dead. 25 years later, the drought came, and with it, Lake Halstead began to give up what it had hidden. August 2023. The heat was merciless. Waves of it shimmered above the cracked, dusty shoreline, as if the horizon itself were bleeding. What had once been a reservoir, teeming with fishermen and swimmers, now resembled a graveyard for forgotten things. Dead fish scattered in pale streaks across the mud. The rusted skeleton of a rowboat leaned awkwardly on its side. Sheriff Ben Harlan wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and squinted into the distance. A crowd had gathered near the south bank, where drought had carved away the last of the water and left a gaping wound in the earth. People whispered, pointed, lifted their phones. He followed their gaze. There, half buried in the dried silt, sat the corroded remains of a Ford F-150. Its hood was crushed, windshield caved in, paint eaten away by years underwater. But it wasn't the truck itself that made his gut tighten. It was the sight of the license plate, still faintly legible through the rust and muck. TXN 473. The number was seared into his memory. He had been a young deputy when the report came in, all those years ago. The disappearance at Lake Halstead had haunted him, followed him through his career like an unfinished sentence. He had stood with their parents, watching mothers collapse in grief when the searches yielded nothing. He had looked into the tear-filled eyes of Daniel's father, who begged him, "Please, just bring them back." Any of them. Now, staring at the truck, he felt something shift inside. "Sheriff?" A deputy's voice cracked through the heat. "You want to take a closer look?" Ben nodded slowly. As he approached, the smell hit first. Old rust and something sour, organic, long soaked into the metal. The mud around the truck was cracked and brittle, making every step crunch beneath his boots. The closer he got, the quieter the crowd behind him became. By the time he reached the hood, the only sound was cicadas buzzing in the brittle trees above. "Get the tape," he muttered. His deputy unspooled yellow crime scene tape, marking off the area. Ben crouched near the driver's side. Through the shattered window, he saw a tangle of fabric caught in the springs of the seat. Something pale blue, once soft, now stained and hardened with age. "Sir," the deputy said softly, pointing toward the back seat. Ben leaned closer, pressing his face near the glass. For a moment, it was only shadows. Then he saw it, a shape, rounded, dark, collapsed in on itself. Bone. The breath caught in his chest. He straightened slowly, pulling off his hat. For 25 years, the town had whispered about Lake Halstead, trading theories in hushed voices. But now, the silence was breaking. The sheriff looked over his shoulder at the crowd. Parents of the missing cousins were long gone. Some dead, some moved away, some still living but hollowed out by grief. Only a handful of locals remembered the night vividly. The rest had grown up with the story like a campfire legend. He raised a hand to quiet them. "We've found something," he said. His voice was steady, but inside, a tremor began. "And I think it's time the truth comes out." The heat bore down, unrelenting. Behind him, the lake whispered its secrets in the crackle of dry mud and the hollow groan of a truck that should have stayed buried. And for the first time in 25 years, the mystery of the 4 vanished cousins stirred awake. The summer of 1998 had been one of those long, endless ones, where the days seemed to stretch without mercy and the nights hummed with cicadas until morning. For 4 cousins, it was meant to be a summer of freedom. Their parents had allowed them one weekend on their own, a camping trip by Lake Halstead, a simple tradition that older generations had done before them. None of them could have known that the memory of that night would freeze in time, suspended in the town's history like a splinter beneath the skin. Daniel Whitaker was the oldest. 17, lanky, with sandy hair that always looked like he just stepped off a soccer field, though he hadn't played in months. He was restless, always talking about college applications and how badly he wanted to leave their small town behind. He carried a cheap guitar everywhere, strumming chords he half knew, inventing songs that were more rhythm than melody. People gravitated toward him. He was the kind of boy who didn't try to lead but ended up leading anyway. That summer, Daniel had been different. His mother noticed it first. He spent longer nights outside, sitting on the porch, staring at the stars. His father caught him once with a bottle of beer stolen from the fridge. His teachers at the high school whispered that Daniel seemed distracted, slipping from the bright future everyone predicted. But his little cousins loved him, especially Emily. To her, he was a hero. Funny, protective, the older brother she never had. Katie Whitaker, Daniel's sister, was 15. Where Daniel was restless, Katie was deliberate. She carried a notebook everywhere, filling it with poems, sketches, and song lyrics copied from CDs she borrowed. She was observant, always watching, always recording in her quiet way. Her parents called her sensitive. Her teachers said she was bright but too shy. Katie and her mother had fought before the camping trip. A fight about clothes, about makeup, about whether she could be trusted on her own. Her last words before leaving the house were sharp. "You never trust me. Maybe you just don't know who I am." Words her mother would replay for decades, wondering if they were the last she'd ever hear from her daughter. Josh Barrett was 13, the cousin who always wanted to be in the middle of the action. He was clumsy, awkward, forever trying to prove himself older than he was. His father worked construction, often gone for weeks, and his mother struggled to raise him alone. Josh found refuge with his cousins, tagging along even when they told him to go home. That summer, Josh had discovered horror movies. He would retell them at the campfire, embellishing the details, his voice cracking but determined to be frightening. He annoyed Daniel endlessly, but Katie sometimes smiled at his enthusiasm. Emily clung to his stories, shivering with both fear and delight. And then there was Emily, 10 years old, the youngest of the four. She had a habit of carrying a stuffed rabbit everywhere, though she swore she was too old for it. Her dark hair was always in braids, her cheeks smudged from playing outside. Emily was curious about everything. She trailed after her cousins with unshakable devotion, desperate not to be left behind. Her parents hesitated to let her go on the camping trip. She was so young. But Daniel promised to look after her. Katie rolled her eyes but agreed. Josh cheered at the idea of having his little sidekick along. And so, Emily packed her sleeping bag, her rabbit, and a small flashlight shaped like a dolphin. She told her mother, "It's just one night. I'll be fine." Her mother kissed her forehead, telling herself it was true. The four cousins had grown up together, their families intertwined like roots of the same tree. Summers at Grandma Barrett's farm, Christmases crowded around the fireplace, birthdays where all the cousins shared cake and laughter. But by 1998, they were changing. Daniel on the verge of adulthood, Katie drifting into her own private world, Josh desperate to grow up too fast, Emily still caught in the magic of childhood. The camping trip was supposed to bring them together one last time before everything shifted. Daniel would soon leave for college. Katie would be in high school. Josh and Emily would be the younger ones left behind. Lake Halstead had always been the chosen place. Their fathers had camped there as boys, back before the lake was swallowed by tourists and fishing tournaments. They knew the shoreline, the trails through the woods, the flat clearing where you could build a fire without fear. That July night, they pitched 2 tents, built their fire, and told themselves they were safe. The cousins laughed and teased, roasted marshmallows, and whispered secrets. They were children standing at the edge of the unknown, unaware of how fragile their world was. Later, investigators would try to piece together their last hours from scraps of evidence and witness reports. A fisherman swore he heard singing across the lake just after midnight. A couple driving home claimed to see flashlights flickering in the woods. Another neighbor insisted he heard a scream, though no one else did. What could be proven was simple. The fire burned down around 2 a.m. The marshmallow bag was left open, half-eaten. Shoes were lined neatly by the tents. Flashlights were untouched. The truck Daniel had borrowed sat parked by the shore. The rest was silence. Over the years, each cousin became a myth in their own way. Daniel, the golden boy, the leader who vanished before his future began. His name whispered in the hallways of the high school long after. Katie, the poet, her notebook found empty in her bedroom. Its last page dated July 10th. The unfinished sentence, "Sometimes I feel like I'm on the edge of disappearing." Josh, the joker, remembered by friends for telling ghost stories that suddenly felt too prophetic. And Emily, forever 10 years old, the girl with the stuffed rabbit and dolphin flashlight, a symbol of innocence swallowed by darkness. For their families, the grief never ended. For the town, the case became a legend. But for the sheriff standing at the edge of Lake Halstead in 2023, watching the rusted truck emerge from the mud, they were not legends. They were still missing children. And for the first time in decades, he felt a tremor of possibility, the chance that the lake was finally ready to confess. July the 10th, 1998. The lake shimmered in the dusk light, a mirror of fading pinks and golds as the sun slipped beneath the horizon. The cousins had spent the late afternoon swimming in the shallows, daring each other to go farther, though none of them trusted the lake's depths. By the time they dragged themselves back to shore, wet hair dripping, Daniel had built the beginnings of a fire pit, and Katie was shaking sand from her notebook. Emily sat cross-legged on a rock, combing her rabbit's ears with wet fingers. Josh darted around collecting sticks, announcing each one like it was a prize catch. "Got one, big one, look at this." He waved a crooked branch overhead. Daniel smirked. "Josh, we're not building a log cabin. Just toss it in." By twilight, the fire crackled, smoke drifting upward into the trees. Moths flitted close, only to vanish in sudden bursts of flame. The air smelled of charred wood, mosquito spray, and marshmallows beginning to blister on their sticks. Time moved lazily, as it does when children are unsupervised, each hour unmeasured but filled. Katie scribbled in her notebook by firelight, her pencil scratching as Daniel hummed chords on his guitar. Josh told his horror stories, half-remembered plots from VHS tapes he wasn't supposed to watch, each punctuated by Emily's squeals of fear and laughter. "They say the lake used to be a town," Josh declared dramatically, his face lit orange by the fire. "They say when they flooded it back in the 50s, they left barns, fences, even a graveyard. So if you dive deep enough, you'll see headstones in the dark, and at night—" He lowered his voice to a whisper. "The ones buried there climb up to the surface." Emily clutched her rabbit tight, eyes wide. "That's not true." Katie looked up from her notebook, eyebrow raised. "You don't even know if there was a graveyard." Daniel flicked a pebble at Josh. "Cut it out. You're scaring her." But later, when the night grew thicker, when the wind carried strange creaks through the trees, Emily would remember those words. The fire burned low. The cousins roasted marshmallows, their faces sticky with sugar. They lay back on their sleeping bags, watching the stars brighten one by one. "I'm leaving next year," Daniel said suddenly, his voice low. "Austin, maybe further." Katie turned her head toward him. "For college?" He nodded. "I can't stay here forever. I want to see something bigger than this place." Josh groaned. "You're just gonna leave us? Some cousin you are." Daniel chuckled, ruffling Josh's hair. "You'll be fine. You'll probably take over the whole town before I'm gone." But Katie saw something in her brother's face, a flicker of unease or guilt, or maybe fear. She wondered if he was already halfway gone in his mind, restless in a way the rest of them couldn't understand. Emily's voice was soft, drowsy. "I hope we all come back here again, even when you're in college." "Promise?" Daniel hesitated, then forced a smile. "Yeah, promise." Midnight crept over the lake. The woods thickened with shadows. A breeze rustled through the leaves, cool against their warm skin. They should have gone to bed. But children rarely sleep when adventure hums in their veins. Katie wandered to the shoreline, her flashlight beam skimming across the rippling black water. She thought she saw movement, something pale shifting beneath the surface, but when she blinked, it was gone. Josh insisted on another story, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say a man drowned here 10 years ago. They never found the body. My friend told me his dad said sometimes you can see him, standing on the shore, waiting." "Josh?" Daniel warned, but his own gaze drifted uneasily toward the tree line. Emily pressed closer to her brother, whispering, "What if it's true?" "It's not," Daniel assured her, though his hand tightened around his flashlight. Time passed in fragments. 12:15 a.m., Katie sketching a moonlit outline of the lake. 12:45 a.m., Emily dozing in her sleeping bag, rabbit clutched to her chest. 1:10 a.m., Josh daring Daniel to swim out farther, Daniel refusing with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. 1:30 a.m., silence, broken only by the hiss of dying embers and the hum of insects. At 1:47 a.m., a detail later pieced together from a neighbor's old alarm clock. A fisherman across the lake swore he heard singing. Not words, just a melody, faint but steady. Some believed it was Daniel with his guitar. Others weren't so sure. At 2:05 a.m., headlights were seen near the access road. A couple driving home claimed they noticed a pickup truck parked by the clearing. They thought nothing of it at the time. At 2:22 a.m., someone, or something, snuffed out the fire. The last glow of embers was lost to the night. And by 3 a.m., silence swallowed everything. Investigators reconstructed the timeline from scraps, but none of it explained what happened next. When the parents arrived in the morning, they found shoes lined neatly by the tents, as if no one had walked away. Flashlights still packed, batteries unused. Marshmallows open on the picnic table, hardening in the heat. Emily's rabbit sitting upright against her pillow, as though placed there deliberately. No signs of a struggle, no footprints, no trail. Just 4 cousins, vanished as though the night itself had taken them. In the years that followed, theories multiplied. Some swore a stranger had been watching them, one of the old drifters rumored to live near the woods. Others whispered about the drowned town beneath the lake, its ghosts reaching upward to claim new lives. A few suspected someone closer to home, someone who knew the cousins, who could approach without fear. But the official timeline ended at 2:22 a.m. when the fire went out. Everything after was silence. And now, in 2023, with the truck resurfaced, Sheriff Harlan found himself staring at those silent hours again. Staring at the gaps. Staring at the places where answers should have been. The lake had begun to speak, but its language was slow, fragmented, layered with decades of mud. And whatever truth it held about the cousins last night was still buried, waiting to surface piece by piece. Morning came quietly over Lake Halstead. The water shimmered like glass, unbroken, as though nothing beneath its surface could ever disturb its stillness. Birds called in the distance. The air was humid and sweet with dew. It should have been a peaceful Saturday. But when Daniel and Katie's parents drove down the dirt road at 8 a.m. to check on the kids, expecting to find sleepy teenagers and breakfast over a cold fire, they found silence instead. The tent stood unzipped, the sleeping bags empty, shoes lined neatly at the entrance, as though waiting for feet that never returned. The fire pit was cold, marshmallows still scattered across the picnic table, their sugar hardened into little stones. "Daniel!" his father called out. "Katie, Josh, Emily!" Only cicadas answered. At first, panic didn't register. The parents checked the shoreline, expecting to see them swimming. They hiked the nearby trail, calling until their voices cracked. They assumed the kids had wandered, that they'd come running back when they heard the car horn. But when half an hour passed with no sign, fear settled into their bones. By 9 a.m., someone called the sheriff's office. By noon, Lake Halstead was no longer quiet. The first deputies arrived quickly. They searched the campsite with practiced eyes, looking for signs of struggle, broken branches, footprints, blood. But the ground was undisturbed, the tents intact, belongings in order. Nothing looked wrong, and yet everything was wrong. Sheriff Ben Harlan was young then, just 32, but he still remembers the expression on the parents' faces when he stepped onto the clearing. Hope and terror tangled together, both waiting for him to say something that would make sense of what they saw. He couldn't. "We'll find them," was all he could manage. "We'll bring them home." By evening, dozens of volunteers had gathered. Neighbors, church members, off-duty firefighters, teenagers from the high school. They carried flashlights and walked in long lines, sweeping the woods in every direction. "Daniel," voices called into the darkening trees. "Katie! Josh! Emily!" Dogs barked, pulling handlers through the underbrush. Boats combed the lake with spotlights, water slapping against aluminum hulls. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights casting pale cones that cut across the trees. The night of July 11th, 1998, the woods around Lake Halstead burned with artificial light, as though the town was trying to force the darkness to give up its secrets. But nothing stirred. The search grew. Within 48 hours, the case made the Dallas Evening News. Reporters set up along the lake, cameras capturing the anguish of parents clutching photos, begging for their children to come home. Daniel's father stood before microphones, his voice breaking. "They're good kids. Please, if anyone knows anything, please, just let them come back." Katie's mother clutched her daughter's notebook to her chest. Josh's aunt held up one of his comic books, still waiting on his nightstand. Emily's mother could barely speak, her hands trembling as she showed a stuffed rabbit to the cameras. The story spread, and with it, strangers came. Psychics offering visions, drifters volunteering only to be questioned, curious onlookers parking along the access roads to gawk at the scene of tragedy. The families endured them all, because silence was worse. Days bled into one another. Search teams dragged the lake, sending divers down into the murky depths. They found fishing poles, tires, the skeleton of an old barn swallowed when the valley flooded decades earlier. But no cousins. The woods yielded nothing. No blood, no clothing, no torn fabric. Leads dried up as quickly as they came. A truck seen by a passing couple. Headlights on the access road. Possible strangers at a nearby gas station. None confirmed, none connected. Each day ended the same. The parents sitting in folding chairs near the campsite, eyes red, waiting for deputies to bring them news. Each day ended in silence. Psychological toll came early. By the third night, Daniel's father was pacing the shoreline with a flashlight, refusing to rest. Katie's mother hadn't eaten since morning, clutching her daughter's notebook until her fingers cramped. Josh's mother collapsed on the grass, sobbing, "He's all I have. He's all I have." Emily's father stood motionless by the tents, staring into the trees as though sheer will might conjure her back. The sheriff tried to offer words, but they fell flat. Faith leaders prayed over the site, their voices trembling. Volunteers promised to return at dawn. The lake gave nothing back. By the end of the first week, the case was already being called the Halstead Four. Newspapers printed their school photos side by side. Neighbors left casseroles on porches. Strangers mailed letters of sympathy. But within the homes, grief festered. Daniel's parents began sleeping in separate rooms. Katie's mother refused to wash her daughter's sheets, insisting the smell of her hair still lingered. Josh's mother tore down his posters, unable to bear their smiling faces. Emily's father stopped going to work altogether, driving the back roads at night searching for headlights that never appeared. Grief made them brittle. Suspicion crept in. Who had been responsible for letting them go unsupervised? Why didn't Daniel keep them safe? Why didn't someone notice headlights near the road? Families who once gathered every Sunday now sat apart, bitterness simmering beneath sorrow. And the town changed, too. Parents forbade their children from camping. Fishermen avoided the far shore. Whispered theories filled the diners and barber shops. Some blamed outsiders. Some blamed the lake. Some blamed the families themselves. The campsite, once a place of laughter, became a scar. No one wanted to go near it. When fall came and the leaves turned, the clearing was left abandoned, tents and tape removed. But the silence hung heavy. No closure came, no bodies, no confessions, no trace. The official record ended in a single line. 4 miners missing, presumed deceased. For years afterward, Sheriff Harlan would find himself at the lake's edge in the quiet hours of the night, replaying those first frantic days. He remembered the sound of parents calling names into the trees. He remembered the hollow ring of silence that answered back. The search had been massive, exhaustive, relentless. But it had also been futile. And now, in 2023, as he stood once more on the dry lake bed watching the rusted truck emerge from the mud, he couldn't help but hear those voices again, calling into the woods, into the water, into nothing. After the first feverish months of searching, the disappearance at Lake Halstead began to shift, from urgent tragedy to lingering shadow. The summer of 1998 bled into fall. The volunteers dwindled. The TV crews left, chasing fresher stories. The flyers stapled to telephone poles turned brittle from rain and sun, their faces fading into ghostly outlines. The campsite was cleared, the tape taken down. By October, nothing remained at the lake but a scar of trampled grass and the echo of unanswered questions. The Halstead Four, as the newspapers had branded them, were no longer headlines. They were just a mystery. A wound the town carried but could not heal. The families fractured under the weight of silence. Daniel and Katie's parents, Robert and Helen Whitaker, rarely spoke of their children aloud. Robert threw himself into work, long hours at the bank until he arrived home exhausted and wordless. Helen spent nights sitting in her daughter's room, flipping through Katie's notebooks, reading and rereading her unfinished poems as if they might reveal where she had gone. They fought over little things, bills, chores, who at last locked the door, and never over the thing that mattered most. By their 20th anniversary, their marriage was a shell. Josh's mother, Carla Barrett, unraveled more quickly. She kept her son's room frozen in time, posters of superheroes still on the walls, socks still in the laundry basket. She left his school books on the desk, pencil mid-sentence. Some nights, she called his name down the hall as though he might answer. She stopped attending church, stopped visiting her sister Helen. The family that once shared Sunday dinners fractured into separate silent houses. Emily's parents, David and Linda Carter, carried the burden most visibly. She was the youngest, the most innocent, the one everyone thought should have been protected. David withdrew, barely speaking, haunted by the stuffed rabbit returned to him from the campsite. Linda clung to that toy as if it were flesh and bone, washing it carefully, placing it on Emily's pillow each night. For years, they both believed she might walk through the door again, tall and grown, explaining where she'd been. When she didn't, their house filled with silence so thick it suffocated. By the early 2000s, the investigation had gone cold. Sheriff Harlan still carried the files in his office, but new cases pushed the Halstead Four into the back drawer. Tips dried up. Witnesses moved. Theories decayed. The FBI had briefly consulted, but without bodies, without evidence, without even a reliable timeline beyond 2:22 a.m., there was little to pursue. The lake had yielded nothing. The woods had yielded nothing. And so the silence hardened. The town of Halstead shifted too. People spoke of the cousins less, but when they did, it was in hushed tones. The campsite became taboo ground. Teenagers dared each other to sneak there at night, whispering that the cousins still roamed the trees. Parents warned their children never to camp alone, never to trust the lake. Some whispered darker theories, that Daniel, the oldest, had led them away on purpose, that Katie had run off with a boy, dragging the others with her, that Josh's horror stories had lured them into danger, that Emily, too young to understand, had simply followed. Rumors became folklore, ghost stories told at sleepovers, whispers about headlights on the access road, about seeing shapes in the fog. The Halstead Four became less like children and more like myths. The families endured anniversaries like punishments. Every July 11th, reporters returned briefly to mark the day, shoving microphones toward mothers who no longer wished to speak. Each year, fewer volunteers gathered at the lake for candlelight vigils. By the 10th anniversary, only the families came. Helen Whitaker lit 4 candles by the water's edge, her hands trembling in the wind. "I can't stop wondering if they're cold," she whispered to her sister Carla. Carla didn't answer. She stared at the water with hollow eyes, as though waiting for it to speak. Time passed unevenly. Some days it seemed the world had moved on completely. New schools were built. New families arrived in Halstead, children playing in parks, unaware of the story that haunted the lake. Other days, the silence roared back with brutal force. A misplaced shoe, a half-finished notebook, a birthday that would never come. Each cousin froze in memory at the age they vanished. Daniel remained 17, restless with the edge of adulthood. Katie remained 15, her last poem unfinished. Josh remained 13, forever telling ghost stories. Emily remained 10, clutching her rabbit, her dolphin-shaped flashlight sitting dark on a shelf. The families carried those frozen versions like photographs etched into their minds. Time marched forward around them, but their children remained still, unchanging as they aged, as they buried grandparents, as their hair turned gray. Sheriff Harlan never escaped it either. He told himself he'd done everything possible. He told himself some mysteries stayed buried. Yet every time he drove past the access road, every time he saw the shimmer of Lake Halstead in the distance, something in him twisted. He remembered the searchlight sweeping the water. He remembered the silence of the tents. The case lived in his drawer, its pages yellowing. On sleepless nights, he read them again, each word familiar, each detail unchanged. 4 missing cousins, vanished, presumed dead. Yet he couldn't close the drawer for good. In the years that followed, droughts came and went. Each time, locals joked nervously, maybe the lake will finally give up its secrets. Each time, the waters rose again before anything surfaced, until 2023, when the lake began to recede further than ever before, when the cracked mud revealed rusted metal, when the whispers of 25 years ago grew louder. The silence that had held Halstead captive for decades was finally beginning to break. The summer of 2023 was hotter than most. The drought had gripped Texas for months, leaving rivers sluggish, cattle pastures brittle, and Lake Halstead drained lower than anyone could remember. By late July, the shoreline looked unfamiliar. Cracked mud where water should have been, sun-bleached tree stumps jutting out like bones. Locals walked the newly exposed ground, curious, snapping photographs of old fences and stone foundations from the drowned town that had once sat at the valley's bottom. And then someone saw it. A corner of metal, orange with rust, poking through the muck. At first, it looked like a piece of farm machinery left behind when the valley was flooded in the 1950s. But when deputies arrived with shovels and began digging, the shape revealed itself. A cab, a bed, the frame of a truck, half swallowed by silt. By the next day, the county had hauled it out with chains and winches. Sheriff Ben Harlan, older now, hair graying at the temples, stood with arms folded as the machine groaned free of the lake's grip. The vehicle broke the surface like a corpse rising, water pouring from its windows, mud streaming down its sides. It was no farm relic. It was a 1984 Ford pickup, once painted blue. The license plate still clung crookedly to the back bumper. The plate matched one listed in the old case files. The truck Daniel Whitaker had borrowed from his uncle the night of the camping trip. Word spread like fire. Within hours, local reporters crowded the dry lake bed, their microphones pointed at deputies who refused to answer. Helicopters circled overhead. Old neighbors who hadn't spoken of the Halstead Four in years now whispered again in hushed voices. They found the truck. After all this time, they found the truck. For the families, it was like a wound ripped open. Helen Whitaker, frail now, clutched her daughter's old notebook in her lap as she sat in her living room watching the news. "Daniel drove that truck," she whispered. "He drove it. He promised he'd look after her." Carla Barrett called the sheriff's office 3 times that night, demanding answers. Was her boy inside? Did they find anything? They wouldn't tell her. Linda Carter, Emily's mother, sat on the floor of her daughter's room, rabbit in her arms, rocking like she had in 1998. "She was so little," she whispered to her husband. "If that truck was there all along, what else is down there?" The forensics team moved quickly. The truck was hauled to a secured garage, its mud-caked body sealed under a tarp. Harlan watched as technicians in gloves and masks circled it like surgeons preparing for a difficult operation. The vehicle was corroded almost beyond recognition, its metal eaten by decades of silt and water. Windows were shattered. The interior was a swamp of rust, algae, and lake sediment. Still, evidence remained. On the passenger side floorboard, a child's sneaker was found, small, white once, now mottled with brown. The size matched Emily Carter's shoe size in 1998. In the bed of the truck, under a tangle of lake weeds, lay scraps of fabric. One piece was pale pink, faded but still holding the faint outline of rainbow stripes. Investigators cross-referenced photos. Katie Whitaker's last known outfit was a striped pink shirt. Near the back seat, wedged against the frame, a flashlight surfaced. Its shape was unmistakable, dolphin-shaped, blue. The room went silent when the technician held it up. Even after 25 years, it was intact. For Sheriff Harlan, the discoveries felt like the ground shifting beneath him. For decades, he had pictured that night as a void. 4 children vanished into silence. Now the silence was cracking. But the new evidence raised more questions than it answered. Why was the truck submerged so far from the campsite? If the cousins vanished together, why weren't all 4 accounted for in or near the vehicle? Had they tried to flee? Had someone forced them inside? Theories multiplied again, just like in 1998. Some said Daniel had tried to drive them away, only to lose control and sink into the lake. But that didn't explain why no bodies were recovered in the truck. Others whispered about a stranger, someone who forced the cousins inside, drove them into the water, and left them to drown. The most disturbing theory was the simplest, that someone they knew, someone from town, had been with them that night. The families were summoned to the sheriff's office one at a time, each shown the recovered items. The sneaker, the fabric, the dolphin flashlight. Each reacted differently. Helen covered her mouth with both hands, rocking in her chair. "Katie loved that shirt," she whispered. "She wore it all summer, and said it made her look older." Carla demanded to know where her son's belongings were. "Why haven't you found Josh's things?" she cried. "What about his baseball cap, his jacket? He wouldn't have left them behind." Linda broke completely when she saw the flashlight. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward it, though she wasn't allowed to touch. "Emily slept with that thing under her pillow," she sobbed. "Every night. She was afraid of the dark. If it's here, then she—" Her voice collapsed into silence. David Carter placed an arm around her, his face stony, but his knuckles white as they gripped the chair. The discovery of the truck reignited the town's imagination. At the diner, old men leaned over coffee, whispering, "Maybe they ran away. Maybe someone helped them." At the grocery store, women spoke in low voices by the produce. "I always thought there was more to that night. Maybe now we'll find out." Teenagers who had been born years after the disappearance posted photographs of the truck on social media, spinning theories their parents had whispered for decades. And though through it all, the lake lay silent again, its shoreline cracked and brittle, as though it had confessed just enough to keep the town hungry for more. Forensic testing began. Fibers were collected. The sneaker was sent to labs. DNA swabs were taken from the flashlight's handle. But decay had done its work. Water had stripped much of the evidence away. Many items would never yield answers. Still, one small miracle remained. Inside the glove compartment, sealed in a plastic sleeve warped by water, was a driver's registration card. Barely legible, the ink smeared, but enough to show that the truck had not only been registered to Daniel's uncle, it had been reissued in a different name the summer before the cousins disappeared. Someone else had driven that truck. The question was who? When the news broke, panic rippled through the families. Helen Whitaker clutched the article, her voice trembling. "If it wasn't Daniel driving, then who put them in there? Who took them?" Carla Barrett raged. "They know more than they're telling us. They've known all along." Linda Carter sat in silence, the rabbit in her lap, rocking again. "Someone from this town," she whispered. "It has to be. Someone we trusted." That night, Sheriff Harlan sat alone in his office, the recovered flashlight on the table before him, sealed in plastic. He stared at it until the room blurred. He thought of Emily's small hand gripping it, 10 years old, eyes wide at her cousin's ghost stories. He thought of Daniel strumming his guitar, Katie scribbling in her notebook, Josh laughing too loudly. And he thought of the truck, buried all those years beneath the water, waiting. The lake had finally given up its first secret. He knew more were coming. The truck should have brought answers. Instead, it cracked the town open. By the second week of August, the story was everywhere. Local news stations replayed footage of the rusted Ford being hauled out of the lake, its frame dripping mud like blood. Regional papers ran headlines. Lake Halstead gives up its secrets. Even national outlets briefly mentioned the find, a reminder of a case most of the country had long forgotten. In Halstead itself, the discovery acted like a storm over dry earth. For 25 years, the town had lived with silence. Now, with one truck, silence gave way to noise. Speculation, accusation, suspicion, louder and sharper than before. The families fractured first. At the sheriff's office meeting where the evidence was presented, the sneaker, the fabric scrap, the flashlight, their reactions tore them apart. Helen Whitaker wept quietly, murmuring her daughter's name as though reciting a prayer. Her husband Robert sat stiff, jaw clenched, refusing to speak. Across the table, Carla Barrett slammed her fist down. "Why is there nothing of Josh's? Why Katie's shirt, Emily's toy, but nothing from my boy?" Her voice shook with fury. "You're hiding something," she accused, eyes darting between the sheriff and Helen. "Or you're not looking hard enough." Helen looked up, startled. "Carla, please." "You always blamed Daniel, didn't you?" Carla snapped. "That he was supposed to be in charge, that he should have protected them. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he led them straight into it." Robert stood so abruptly his chair screeched. "You watch your mouth." "Or what?" Carla shot back. "The truck was in your family's name. Maybe you've known more than you let on all these years." Silence fell. Even Linda Carter, pale and trembling, flinched at the words. It took Sheriff Harlan's stern voice to end it. "Enough. We're here to find answers, not destroy each other." But the damage lingered, carried home like smoke on clothes after a fire. In the days that followed, the families stopped speaking altogether. The Whitakers retreated into their home, blinds drawn. Robert told anyone who asked that Daniel's name would not be dragged through the mud again. Not by neighbors, not by family. Helen spent nights rereading Katie's notebooks, searching for clues in poems about rivers, stars, and longing. Carla's bitterness hardened. She began attending community meetings, demanding the sheriff release all the files to the public. "If they won't find the truth, we will," she told reporters. Neighbors whispered that grief had curdled into obsession. The Carters suffered in quieter ways. Linda withdrew, answering no calls, rocking in Emily's room for hours. David forced himself into activity, mowing the lawn twice in a week, fixing shelves no one used, as though physical labor might shield him from thought. But even he could not escape the weight of the flashlight, now evidence sealed in a bag at the sheriff's office. The bonds that had once tied the families together, dinners, shared grief, Sunday vigils, were gone. Each house was its own island, drifting farther from the others. The town followed suit. At the diner, voices lowered when someone walked past. "Did you hear the truck wasn't even registered to the uncle at the time?" One woman whispered over pie. "What if it wasn't Daniel driving that night?" At the gas station, men leaned against their trucks. Could have been someone local. Who else knew those kids would be camping alone? Names began surfacing. Old suspicions revived. A farmhand who'd left town abruptly in 1999. A gas station attendant who had a habit of watching young girls too closely. Even Sheriff Harlan wasn't immune. Some muttered that he hadn't searched hard enough, that maybe he'd looked the other way. The case became less about 4 missing cousins and more about the people still living in Halstead. Each shadow cast a little longer. For Sheriff Harlan, the tension was familiar, almost déjà vu. He remembered the first weeks in 1998 when suspicion bloomed like weeds. Then, it had faded as silence calcified. Now it returned sharper, older, angrier. He spent nights reviewing the files, then walking the lake bed by flashlight, staring at the cracked earth where the truck had lain. His deputies urged him to release fewer details to the press, but he refused. Transparency, he said, was the only way to quiet rumors. But transparency only fueled them. The evidence itself refused to settle. The sneaker was confirmed as Emily's size, but the DNA degraded. Inconclusive. The fabric bore Katie's rainbow pattern, but no usable trace remained. The flashlight showed small scratches along its handle, possibly from fingernails clawing in fear. But that, too, could not be proved. The registration card was the only piece that screamed louder than whispers. Someone else had held ownership of the truck in the summer of 1998. A name, blurred by water, letters bleeding, but visible enough. Caraway. The sheriff froze when he saw it. He knew that family. Everyone in Halstead did. The Caraways were a line of mechanics and scrapyard operators, known for hauling, fixing, reselling. They'd owned land south of town for decades. Dean Caraway ran the yard now, his younger brother Micah the quiet one, his son Reed, once a boy with a chip on his shoulder. None of them had ever been linked to the cousins' case. But now, a single registration card shifted the weight. When Harlan mentioned it to the families in a closed-door meeting, the reaction was instant. "Caraway," Carla's voice cracked. "I knew it. I always said someone local. Someone who could hide it in plain sight." Helen paled. Dean's boys went to school with Daniel. They were older. They knew him. David Carter clenched his jaw. If that truck was in their name, why didn't they say something in 1998? Harlan cautioned patience, investigation, due process. But he saw it in their eyes. Patience was gone. 25 years of silence had snapped. Within days, gossip spread faster than fact. People whispered about Reed Caraway's temper as a teenager, about odd jobs he'd done near the lake. Some swore they'd seen Dean's truck near the access road that summer. Others claimed Micah had once told a strange story about headlights over the water. None of it was proven. All of it was believed. The Caraways became pariahs overnight. Dean boarded up the windows of his yard office. Reed refused interviews, cursing at reporters. Micah kept to himself, shoulders hunched at the grocery store, ignoring the stares. And in kitchens and porches across Halstead, people said the same thing. Maybe the silence is finally breaking. Maybe we'll learn the truth. But truth in Halstead was no longer a shared goal. It was a weapon, turned neighbor against neighbor, family against family. The truck had not only resurfaced from the lake, it had dragged the whole town back into the water with it. That night, as storm clouds gathered over Halstead for the first time in months, Helen Whitaker stood at her window, watching the sky flash. Her husband slept in the other room. She whispered her children's names into the thunder. Katie, Daniel. And she wondered if silence was better after all. The name on the registration card changed everything. Caraway. For 25 years, the Caraways had been little more than background figures in Halstead life. They owned the auto salvage yard south of town, kept mostly to themselves, came to church on Christmas and Easter. The family's reputation wasn't spotless. They were known for cutting corners on repairs, for tempers that flared easily. But nothing about them had ever tied them to the Halstead Four. Now, with one blurred word on waterlogged paper, the past rushed back like a tide. Sheriff Ben Harlan began quietly digging. The yard was still there, a sprawling maze of rusted cars stacked like tombstones, weeds curling up through their frames. Dogs barked from behind fences as he pulled up. Dean Carraway, thick-shouldered and balding, stepped from the office, suspicion already in his eyes. "You've been all over the news," Harlan said evenly. "You know why I'm here?" Dean crossed his arms. "Truck at the lake. Your family's name is on its registration." "Was," Dean corrected. "A long time ago. We junked 100 trucks back then. People signed titles over to us for cash, scrap, parts. Doesn't mean a thing." Harlan studied him. "That truck belonged to Daniel Whitaker's uncle before your name appeared." Dean shrugged. "Then someone sold it, or left it on our lot. We didn't keep records the way you want us to now." It was true enough. Salvage yards in the 90s often traded vehicles with little more than a handshake, but it left a gap large enough for suspicion to slither through. "Do you remember who brought it in?" Harlan pressed. Dean's gaze slid away. "Too long ago." Harlan drove away unsatisfied, the sound of the barking dogs echoing in his ears. He turned instead to Micah Carraway, Dean's younger brother. Micah was quieter, the kind of man who avoided eye contact, who'd always been seen sweeping the yard or hauling parts. He lived alone in a trailer on the back of the property. When Harlan knocked, Micah opened the door just enough to look out. His eyes were pale, watery, like someone who hadn't slept well in years. "You know what this is about," Harlan said gently. Micah nodded. His voice was gravel. "The kids. Did you see that truck the summer of '98? Micah hesitated. His lips twitched as if forming words he couldn't quite release. Then, "I don't remember." But his eyes betrayed him. They darted away, searching the ground, as though the truth might be buried there. The last was Reed, Dean's son. He had been a teenager in 1998, just 19. Now he was 44, still wiry, hair thinning, eyes sharp with defiance. Harlan found him at the yard, sleeves rolled up, oil staining his hands. "You drove a Ford in the 90s, didn't you?" Harlan asked. Reed smirked. "We drove everything. Cars came through all the time. People say you hung around the lake back then. People say a lot. You knew Daniel Whitaker." Reed's smirk faded, replaced by something harder. "Everyone knew Daniel. Golden boy. Football, guitar, all the girls after him. But he wasn't so golden." Harlan's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Reed leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You dig long enough, Sheriff. You'll see. Daniel wasn't the saint his mama remembers. Maybe that night he wasn't a victim. Maybe he was the reason." The words hung heavy, like bait dangled in dark water. By the time Harlan left the yard, the story had already leaked. Someone had seen his cruiser there, had told a neighbor, who told a cousin, who told a reporter. That evening, the local news ran a segment. Carraway family name linked to Halstead truck. Within 24 hours, the Carraways were under siege. Reporters parked across from the yard, their cameras trained on the rusting fences. Volunteers from the old search parties came forward with memories of seeing Dean's truck on the access road. A waitress swore Reed once boasted he knew what happened at Halstead. The Carraways denied everything, but denial carried little weight. In a town starved for answers, rumor fed like fire. The families reacted with fresh fractures. Carla Barrett seized on the news with desperate certainty. "I knew it," she told anyone who would listen. "I said all along it wasn't Daniel. Someone else was there, and now we know who." Helen Whitaker recoiled. "Don't you dare," she said, trembling. "Don't you dare put this on my boy." Carla snapped back. "It's not on him if you believe me, it's on them." But Helen's eyes filled with tears, because Reed's words to Harlan, that maybe Daniel wasn't innocent, echoed in her ears. Linda Carter said little, but in her silence was something worse than accusation: dread. If the Carraways had been involved, what had Emily endured before the lake swallowed the truck? As weeks passed, old wounds deepened. Neighbors avoided eye contact at church. The Carraways stopped showing up altogether. The Whitakers received anonymous notes in their mailbox. Ask Daniel what really happened. Carla found one on her porch, scrawled in jagged letters. Josh is still waiting. The town was unraveling, suspicion woven into every glance, every whispered word. One night, unable to sleep, Harlan returned to the evidence room. He sat before the flashlight, the sneaker, the fabric scrap. He replayed Reed's smirk, Dean's evasions, Micah's haunted eyes. The Caraway connection was undeniable. But what did it mean? Ownership of a truck did not prove murder. Whispers did not prove guilt. Yet the silence of 1998 had shifted into noise. And noise could be just as dangerous. He thought of the lake, how it had kept its secrets for 25 years. And he wondered if what it was finally giving up wasn't truth, but something darker. Division. Paranoia. The kind of fractures that never heal. Outside, rain began to fall for the first time in months, spattering the dry earth. The sound sharp against the windows. For years the families had prayed for the lake to give them answers. Now that it had, none of them were ready for the questions that followed. The first heavy rains of August swept across Halstead like a cleansing. For days, the cracked earth drank greedily, the lake swelling inch by inch. By the week's end, puddles stood where the truck had been unearthed, and the shoreline was shifting again. Sheriff Harlan knew the window was closing. If the water rose much higher, whatever else the lake bed still held would be lost again. He called in a dive team. On the morning of August 19th, the sky was low and gray, humidity thick as syrup. The divers suited up at the edge of the exposed shoreline, their tanks hissing, their masks fogging with breath. Harlan stood with his deputies, boots sinking in the mud. The families had been asked not to come, but several arrived anyway, watching from behind the barricade. Helen with her shawl pulled tight, Carla pacing like a caged animal, Linda clutching Emily's rabbit against her chest. "You think you'll find them?" a reporter asked, microphone thrust toward Harlan. He didn't answer. He didn't dare. The divers waded in. The water was murky, churned by storms, visibility reduced to a few feet. They swept in grids, searching the depressions and silt beds exposed by the drought. Hours passed. Deputies passed out bottled water. Families waited in silence. The press grew restless. Then a call came from the lake. Something had been found. It was a bundle at first, tangled in fishing line and weeds. Divers carried it carefully to shore, laying it on a tarp. When the mud was rinsed away, the object revealed itself. A backpack. Blue nylon, straps frayed, zipper half-eaten by rust. Linda Carter gasped. "That's Emily's." Her voice cracked. She begged for that backpack for school. Inside were waterlogged notebooks. The ink melted into blue smears. A pencil case. A sticker of a dolphin. The crowd hushed. The rabbit in Linda's arms trembled with her sobs. The divers went back down. Later that afternoon, they surfaced with something heavier, metallic, box-like. It took 3 men to haul it through the mud to land. A cooler, red plastic, lid cracked, handle snapped. When it was pried open, silence fell again. Inside were bones, small, fragmented, tangled with strands of cloth. The forensic technician knelt, gloves trembling. "Animal remains," she announced after a beat, pulling free what looked like the skull of a raccoon. Relief rippled through the crowd, followed by shame, that they could feel relief at such a thing. But beneath the animal bones, something else lay pressed into the mud. A knife. Rust pitted, blade dulled, but unmistakable. The discovery set the families into spirals. Carla shouted across the barricade, her voice hoarse. "That's it, isn't it?" That's what happened to them. Someone cut them down. Helen turned away, whispering Daniel's name like a prayer, as if shielding him from accusation. Linda collapsed to her knees, clutching the rabbit, whispering over and over, "Not Emily, not Emily." Reporters scribbled, cameras flashed, deputies tried to restore order. But there was no order left in Halstead. That night, as the evidence was logged, Harlan stayed behind in the garage. He stared at the knife sealed in plastic, its handle wrapped in cracked black tape. It could have been anyone's. Hunters, campers, fishermen, all carried knives. But something about the way it had been hidden, buried under bones and mud, gnawed at him. He thought of Reed Carraway's smirk. Maybe Daniel wasn't the saint. And he thought of Micah's haunted eyes, the way his voice had caught on the word kids. The lake had kept more than secrets. It had kept lies. The divers returned the next day. Rain threatened again, but the water had not yet risen high enough to reclaim the site. This time they searched deeper, toward the old channel that cut through the valley. Hours later, one diver surfaced, voice sharp through his mask. They had found a shoe. When it was brought up, it was stiff with silt, laces fused together, faded leather, the kind of high-top sneaker popular in the late 90s. On the tongue, still visible beneath the muck, was a stitched name, Josh. Carla Barrett screamed when she saw it. The sound carried across the lake, across the town, a raw wail of grief and vindication. "They killed him," she cried, clawing at the barricade. "They killed my boy and dumped him here?" Deputies held her back, reporters shoved forward, and the chaos drowned out Harlan's orders. The shoe was sealed, tagged, taken away, but its weight lingered long after. By the week's end, the divers had found nothing more. The rains came heavy again, the lake swelling, swallowing the scars of mud. The window was closed, but the evidence remained. Emily's backpack, a knife. Josh's shoe. Fragments, but enough to reignite the investigation, to sharpen suspicion like a blade. At the family's homes, grief curdled into obsession. Helen sat in Katie's room, rocking with her notebooks, whispering, "If Daniel drove them away, why is his name not on the truck?" Carla pinned Josh's shoe to her wall like a relic, vowing she would not rest until the Carraways were in handcuffs. Linda refused to leave Emily's room, the backpack propped in the corner like a shrine, her hands raw from washing the rabbit again and again. Each house became its own tomb, filled with artifacts of children who had never returned. And in the town, suspicion spread. At the barber shop, that knife, they say it came from the scrapyard. Carraways always had knives like that. At the church, maybe Daniel tried to protect them. Maybe that's why his name isn't on anything. At the diner, what if the lake still hasn't given up all of them? What if something else is down there, waiting? The water rose, covering the scars, hiding whatever else lay beneath. But for the first time in 25 years, Halstead believed the truth might finally be within reach. And the truth terrified them more than silence ever had. By early September, the air in Halstead felt charged, as if every breath carried static. The lake had risen back to its usual level, swallowing the mud, smoothing the surface until it looked like any other quiet body of water. But the town knew better. Beneath that calm lay a truck, a backpack, a knife, a shoe, and the memory of 4 cousins who never came home. The evidence should have united the families in grief. Instead, it drove them into war. The breaking point came at the community meeting. The town hall overflowed. Families pressed shoulder to shoulder, reporters crammed at the back, deputies stationed by the doors. On stage, Sheriff Harlan stood flanked by his investigators, folders stacked before him. He looked tired, his voice gravel as he began. "We've recovered several items from the lake bed," he said, repeating what everyone already knew. Emily Carter's backpack, a knife, Josh Barrett's sneaker. These are now in forensic testing. Nothing is conclusive yet. He paused. The crowd murmured. And the truck, he added, was at one time registered under the Carraway family. A ripple spread through the hall. Carla Barrett shot to her feet, her voice slicing through the noise. "Then arrest them!" she cried. "Arrest the Carraways for what they did to my boy!" Shouts erupted, some in agreement, others protesting. Helen Whitaker stood too, trembling. "Don't you see? This proves nothing. Daniel was driving that truck. He could have—" "No!" Carla screamed, pointing across the room. "You won't put this on him again. Your Daniel failed them. He failed Katie, and he failed Josh, and he failed Emily." Helen flinched as if struck. Robert Whitaker stood, fists clenched. "Watch yourself, Carla." "Or what?" she spat. "You'll cover for your son again?" Linda Carter's voice rose thin and sharp. "Stop it. Stop it, both of you. My Emily is gone. Do you think this screaming will bring her back?" But the room had turned. From the crowd, someone shouted, "Carraway's knew." They knew all along. Another, "Daniel Whitaker drove that truck. Don't let them fool you." The shouting swelled. Fists shook. Chairs scraped. Deputies rushed forward as the meeting dissolved into chaos. On stage, Harlan slammed his hand on the podium. "Enough! Sit down!" His voice broke like thunder, but few listened. The fracture had become a chasm. The next morning, the fallout hit the town like wildfire. Graffiti appeared on the Carraway scrapyard fence. Murderers. Someone nailed a cross to their gate, draped in a child's shoe. Dean Carraway roared, tearing it down, shotgun in hand. "Come at me yourself," he shouted at the empty road. Reed grew more volatile, slamming tools in the yard, daring anyone to step close. "You think you can pin this on us?" he snarled at a reporter. "You'll regret it." Micah, pale and silent, began wandering town at odd hours, staring at the lake as though it whispered his name. Meanwhile, the Whitakers withdrew further. Helen stopped going to the grocery store, sending Robert instead. Neighbors said she sat by the window every evening, eyes red, clutching Katie's notebooks. Carla Barrett doubled down. She printed flyers with Josh's photo and the words, "Justice now. Arrest the Carraways." She tacked them to telephone poles, handed them out outside the church. Linda Carter grew quieter still. Emily's backpack remained in her living room like a shrine. She polished it with trembling hands, whispering her daughter's name. David worried, but he too had begun to break, haunting the hardware store aisles at night, as though tools could fix a shattered past. For Sheriff Harlan, the pressure mounted. Every call was another demand. Arrest them, release the files, prove Daniel's guilt, clear Daniel's name. The case was less an investigation now than a storm swallowing everything. He sat late in his office, staring at the knife sealed in plastic. The rust, the tape, the weight of it. It felt like a curse. Deputy Morales entered, setting a folder on his desk. "You need to see this." Inside were lab results. DNA traces too degraded for certainty, but faint markers clung to the handle of the flashlight, to the inside of the shoe. Partial matches, not enough for arrest. Enough to keep the fire burning. Harlan rubbed his temples. He could feel the town splitting apart like wood under an axe. That weekend, the fracture turned violent. At the diner, Carla confronted Reed Carraway directly. He was seated with coffee, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. She stormed to his table, shoving Josh's photograph in his face. "You did this," she hissed. "You and your family. You put my boy at the bottom of that lake." Reed stood slowly, eyes flashing. "Say that again." "You murdered them." The crack of glass shattering came next. His mug hurled against the wall. Diners screamed. Deputies rushed in. By evening, the story spread. Reed had to be dragged out, shouting, "Maybe they deserved what they got." The town erupted. That night, Helen Whitaker woke to the sound of stones hitting her window. She pulled the curtains back, heart hammering, and saw shadows moving by the road. Voices chanting, "Daniel did it. Daniel did it." She collapsed to the floor, clutching her chest. Robert ran outside with a bat, but the shadows scattered. Only echoes remained. At the same hour, the Carraways' yard was set ablaze. Someone lit tires along the fence line, flames climbing into the night. Dean and Reed scrambled with hoses, dogs barking madly, smoke choking the air. When deputies arrived, Dean roared at them, "Protect us or I'll do it myself." By dawn, Halstead was a town at war with itself. Families turned against families, neighbors against neighbors, each convinced the other carried guilt. The lake had given up its secrets, yes, but in doing so, it had broken the fragile peace Halstead had lived in for 25 years. And for the first time, Sheriff Harlan wondered if the truth, when it finally came, would be worse than the silence. The fire at the scrapyard didn't kill anyone, but it burned away the last of the Carraways' defenses. The next day, Halstead buzzed with whispers. Some said Dean had fired warning shots into the air. Others swore Reed had chased men with a wrench through the smoke. But the story that mattered came from the hospital. Micah Carraway had collapsed during the chaos, chest pain, shortness of breath. The paramedics brought him in, oxygen mask strapped to his face, his pale eyes fluttering. For the first time in 25 years, Micah was away from the yard, away from his brother and nephew. Sheriff Harlan knew it was a chance. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and rain-soaked clothing. Machines beeped softly, steady as a metronome. Micah lay propped on pillows, his skin gray, his breath shallow. Harlan pulled a chair to the bedside. He didn't bother with a notebook. "You've carried something too long," he said quietly. "I can see it in your eyes." Micah blinked slowly. His lips trembled, words catching like fish on a line. "They don't stop screaming," he whispered. Harlan leaned closer. "Who?" "The kids." The sheriff's chest tightened. "You saw them?" Micah nodded once, jerky, like a man trying to shake off a nightmare. "They came to the yard. The truck. Dean said it was nothing, just scrap. But I saw the blood on the seat." Harlan felt the world narrow to that single word. Blood. Whose blood? Micah's eyes filled with tears. "The boy's, the Barrett boy. Head split. He wouldn't stop twitching." His voice cracked, breaking into a sob that sounded torn from years of silence. Harlan gripped the chair arms, forcing calm. "What happened at the lake, Micah?" "They weren't supposed to die," he whispered. "It was a mistake. Dean said Daniel was showing off drinking, driving too fast. Truck went into the rocks, but when they dragged it out, his breath caught, rattling. Not all of them were moving." The confession spilled in broken fragments, as though memory itself was jagged glass. Micah spoke of Daniel slumped over the wheel, neck bent wrong, Katie screaming, Josh bleeding, Emily silent. He spoke of Dean and Reed arriving at the lake in the dark, headlights cutting across water. He said Dean told him not to ask questions, just help. They pulled the truck from the rocks, bodies half inside, half out. "They wanted it gone," Micah whispered. "Said it was better than the sheriff knowing. Said the families would never forgive." "Did they kill the ones still alive?" Harlan asked, heart hammering. Micah's eyes glazed, lips trembling. "I heard crying, little girl's voice, but Dean said it was cats in the weeds. He told me to shut up." He turned his head toward the window, tears leaking down. "I didn't shut up in my head. I still hear her." By the time Harlan left the hospital, his hands shook. Micah's words weren't a neat confession. They were half memory, half hallucination. But they carried too much weight to ignore. If true, they meant the disappearance hadn't been a clean abduction or a cold-blooded murder. It had begun with an accident, and been covered up. But by who? Daniel, Dean, Reed, or all of them together? The sheriff brought the fragments to the families. The Whitakers resisted first. "No," Helen said, her voice brittle. "Not Daniel. He wouldn't drink, he wouldn't drive reckless. He was careful, he loved those kids." Carla's fury exploded. "So what then? You're saying Dean Carraway cleaned it up? Hid my boy in the lake like garbage?" Linda Carter sat trembling, rabbit clutched in her lap. "Micah said he heard crying," she whispered. Emily. My Emily. She was alive. The room fell silent at that. The possibility was unbearable. Word of the confession leaked, of course. Within days, the whole town was dissecting Micah's words. Some believed Daniel had been drunk, reckless, guilty. Others said Dean had murdered the children to hide the accident. Some swore Reed had finished off whoever survived. No one agreed, no one forgave. The Carraways barricaded themselves in the yard. Reed armed, Dean pacing, Micah fading in his hospital bed. The Whitakers stopped leaving their house altogether. Carla camped on the courthouse steps, demanding indictments. Linda lit candles every night, whispering Emily's name until dawn. And Sheriff Harlan lay awake, replaying Micah's voice over and over. They weren't supposed to die. The words gnawed at him because they weren't an ending. They were a beginning. If some of the cousins had survived the crash, then where had they gone? And why, after 25 years, had no trace of their bones been found in the lake? On the last day of August, the rain stopped. The sun burned hot again, the lake shrinking by inches. As Harlan stood at the shore, watching the receding water, a thought struck him cold. What if the lake had not kept them at all? What if someone had taken what was left away? The drought returned in September, harsher than before. The lake dropped fast, shoreline stretching outward like a wound reopening. Each day, new scars appeared. Old fence posts, a rusted swing set, the remains of a dock long forgotten. And then, one morning, a boy walking his dog found something else. An old dirt road had surfaced near the far bank, winding into the woods. It hadn't been seen in decades, not since the reservoir had swallowed that end of the valley. But now, baked by sun, it was visible again, leading not into the water, but away from it. Sheriff Harlan followed it with 2 deputies. The path was narrow, hemmed by cedars, but unmistakably man-made. After half a mile, it ended in a clearing. At its center stood the ruins of a farmhouse. It was skeletal, roof caved, boards rotted, windows shattered. Kudzu crawled across the siding, branches thrust through the broken walls, but the structure still stood, stubborn and defiant, as though waiting. Harlan felt his chest tighten. The families had begged for closure. Now, he feared, they might finally get it. The deputies pried the warped door. The smell inside was thick, mold and rodent droppings, the musk of damp earth. Light filtered in through cracks, revealing a room of dust and shadows. At first, it was only debris. Rusted cans, broken furniture, collapsed beams. Then, one deputy called softly, "Sheriff, you need to see this." In the corner of the back room was a mattress, black with mildew. Beside it, a shoe, small, white, children's size. The farmhouse became a crime scene within hours. Yellow tape stretched across the clearing, evidence markers planted like grave flowers. Forensics teams moved carefully, photographing, bagging, dusting. They found bones beneath the floorboards. Not whole skeletons, but fragments, small, delicate, gnawed by time and rodents. They found fabric scraps, a pink sleeve, a strip of denim, what might have been part of a floral dress. And in a rusted coffee tin buried beneath loose boards, they found photographs, faded Polaroids. The cousins, alive. Daniel sitting stiff on a chair, blood dried in his hair. Katie curled in a corner, face streaked with tears. Josh lying on a mattress, eyes closed, his body bruised but breathing. Emily clutching her backpack, staring wide-eyed at the camera. All 4 in the farmhouse. After the night they vanished. The photos broke the town. They weren't just evidence, they were windows into the hours after the accident, or whatever it had been. Proof the cousins had survived long enough to be hidden here. Proof someone had kept them. The families wailed when shown. Helen collapsed, whispering Daniel's name. Carla clawed at the table, screaming Josh's. Linda buried her face in the rabbit, unable to look at Emily's terrified eyes. The Carraways were brought in for questioning. Dean stonewalled. Reed spat curses. Micah wept, begging them not to show him the pictures again. But the farmhouse spoke louder than any of them. In the weeks that followed, investigators pieced together the fragments. The truck crash had been real. Daniel likely drunk, showing off driving too fast. The impact on the rocks injured them all, but not fatally. Dean and Reed had been called. Whether by Daniel or by chance, no one knew. They'd pulled the truck out, found the cousins battered and bleeding, and made a choice. Not to take them to the hospital, not to call the sheriff, but to hide them. Why? Theories spun like vultures. Some said Dean feared liability, that a drunk driving accident tied to Daniel would ruin his business, shame the Whitakers, drag the Carraways into scandal. Others whispered darker reasons, that Reed had wanted control, that the cousins had seen something they weren't meant to. What mattered was this: the cousins were taken to the farmhouse, and they never came out. The bones could not all be matched. DNA was degraded, fragments incomplete. Only Josh's sneaker, Emily's backpack, Katie's notebooks, and Daniel's watch, found lodged between floorboards, provided certainty. There would be no clean answers. Only evidence enough to wound forever. The Carraways denied murder. They were already dead, Dean insisted. We just hid what was left. But the Polaroids told otherwise. They showed breath in their bodies, fear in their eyes. Life, however brief. And someone had chosen to let that life fade. The farmhouse was torn down within the month. Some called it justice, others erasure. The family stood at the edge of the clearing, watching bulldozers reduce walls to splinters, floors to dust. Helen held Katie's notebooks to her chest. Carla gripped Josh's shoe so hard her knuckles bled. Linda clutched Emily's rabbit, whispering her name into the wind. They had answers now, but no peace, because closure is not the same as healing, and truth is not the same as justice. For Sheriff Harlan, the weight never lifted. He walked the lake's edge most evenings, watching water lap at the shore. He thought of the flashlight, the backpack, the shoe, the knife. Objects that had waited years for the world to listen. The Halstead Four were gone. The families were broken. The Carraways sat in cells, still denying, still snarling. And the town would never be the same. Because some lakes give up their secrets slowly, and some secrets change everything. The farmhouse was gone. The clearing where it had stood was nothing more than churned dirt and splintered boards, bulldozed into absence. But the emptiness did not erase what had happened there. People still drove past the barricades at night, headlights cutting across the field. Some said they saw figures at the edge of the trees, 4 children, waiting. Others swore they heard voices, faint cries carried on the wind. Sheriff Harlan didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in memory, and memory could haunt just as fiercely. In October, the Carraways went to trial. Dean stood rigid, jaw tight, denying everything. Reed sneered through every testimony, muttering under his breath until the judge threatened contempt. Micah shuffled in with oxygen tubes, frail and pale, whispering apologies no one wanted to hear. The evidence was damning: Polaroids, personal items, forensic traces. But it was also fragmented, contradictory, blurred by time. The jury convicted Reed and Dean of evidence tampering, unlawful disposal of remains, child endangerment. But murder could not be proven beyond doubt. It was not the justice the families had begged for. It was the justice the law could offer. After the verdict, the families scattered. Helen and Robert Whitaker left town, unable to bear the whispers, the graffiti carved into their mailbox. Daniel killed them. They moved 2 states away, taking Katie's notebooks with them. Helen never stopped reading them, page by page, every night. Carla Barrett stayed. She turned her house into a shrine to Josh. Photos lining the walls, his shoes sealed in a glass case, candles burning every evening. She spoke at town meetings, schools, churches. Don't let your children be forgotten. Some found her voice inspiring, others found it unbearable. Linda Carter never recovered. Emily's rabbit remained on the mantel, faded and limp. Some nights, neighbors heard her singing lullabies into the empty dark. David filed for divorce in silence, unable to carry the weight of her grief alongside his own. The families had once been bound together by blood. Now they were bound only by absence. And the town of Halstead, it wore its scars openly. The diner where Reed had thrown his mug closed. The church saw dwindling numbers. The scrapyard fell into ruin, its fence sagging, its gates rusted shut. Children whispered about the lake, dared each other to swim at night. Some swore they felt hands tugging at their ankles. Parents forbade it, but curiosity always won. The Halstead Four became both legend and warning. On the 26th anniversary of the disappearance, Sheriff Harlan retired. At his farewell gathering, townsfolk shook his hand, thanked him for his years of service. But he knew they also whispered that he had failed, that he had let the truth stay buried too long, that justice had slipped through his fingers. That night, instead of going home, he drove to the lake. The moon shimmered on the water, calm, indifferent. He walked to the shore, boots sinking into the mud, and closed his eyes. He heard them. Not ghosts, not voices carried by the wind, but echoes. The echoes of children who had camped here once, who had laughed and fought and dreamed of growing up. Katie with her notebooks, Josh with his mischief, Emily with her backpack, Daniel with his restless energy. They were not here. Not really. But in Halstead they would never leave. The story of the Halstead Four became a warning passed from one generation to the next, about secrets, about silence, about what happens when fear buries truth. Every anniversary, candles floated on the lake, their flames wavering against the dark. And sometimes, when the droughts came, when the water line shrank back and the mud cracked, people wondered what else the lake might still be keeping. Because lakes do not forget, they only wait.